Hello, this is Dr. Lindsay again. And in this video, what I want to do is go through what happens with fiscal policy in the short run and what happens in the long run. And we'll use this Keynesian model. We'll use the short run model to figure out what happens in the short run. We'll use the long run model to figure out what fiscal policy does in the long run. So now when we're looking at fiscal policy, we can look at it as either the government is trying to stimulate the economy or trying to contract the economy. Trying to increase aggregate demand or trying to decrease aggregate demand. So we could say, well, we have a policy that's either contractionary or expansionary. Maybe there's a somewhere in between, a neutral type of policy. But an expansionary policy, which would be trying to expand the economy, increase aggregate demand, would be a policy of increasing government spending or lowering taxes, or both. And a contractionary policy then would be lowering government spending or increasing taxes, or both. Now, contractionary policy generally is not done. At least it's not done to try to contract the economy. Because remember, these are politicians that are doing this. This is Congress and the president. One thing they don't want to do, we're seen doing, is intentionally trying to contract the economy. Generally, they're always trying to stimulate the economy. So this is generally not done. There are times when there's taxes are going up and government spending is going down. That's usually for other reasons, where they're trying to balance the budget, or they feel like spending is getting out of control and government is spending too much, and they want taxes lowered. But just to try to contract the economy because it's doing really well is not done. So now where does the government get the money to do this spending? Say they want to expand the economy, get the economy going, increase government spending. Well, where does it come from? Only two things, only two places it can come from. Either from taxes, so the G comes from taxes, they increase taxes, or they borrow it. They borrow the money. They issue these savings bonds, government bonds, it's a way of borrowing money. Or they borrow the money. These bonds the government issues, they're just borrowing money. Well, if they get it from taxes, they increase taxes so they can spend more. It's kind of like pressing on the brake and the gas at the same time. Increasing government spending, increase aggregate demand, increasing taxes lowers aggregate demand. And for the most part, they balance each other out. Keynes thought there would be a net positive effect. They thought you could increase government spending and it would increase GDP. And because GDP is higher, more taxes are going to come in. And that would pay for the increase in government spending. Doesn't seem like it's worked out. That was just his guess of what he thought might happen. I think all practical applications of seeing what's going on, they balance each other out. It's like hitting the brake and the gas at the same time. Well, what about borrowing money? That's the way it's usually done. Borrow the money and start government spending going. Because you certainly wouldn't want to raise taxes if there was a recession or depression. So that means that the government won't have enough money coming in from taxes to start spending money. So they got to go out and borrow it. And that leads to its own problems with big deficits and debts. In other words, the government starts spending more than it brings in, and that's a deficit. And it just keeps the national debt of how much the country owes getting bigger and bigger. It might be okay. It might not be okay. Keynes was kind of thinking sometimes you would run a surplus and have extra government money coming in, and sometimes you would have a deficit and you just kind of balance things out. Save the money in the good times when taxes are more than government spending, use them for the bad times. But that's never happens. They never seem to run with extra money left over for the government. They never seem to collect more taxes than they spend. There's one time I remember when that happened about 20 years ago. We're actually running a surplus, bringing in more taxes than we're spending in this country, but it didn't last very long. If there's a surplus, politicians will figure out a way to spend it. So now let's take a look at fiscal policy here in the short run and the long run using this new Keynesian model. So we've got an aggregate supply curve, upward sloping, aggregate demand curve, downward sloping, inflation on the vertical axis, and output on the horizontal axis. Now, a recessionary gap also is known as a negative output gap. That would mean that our equilibrium output, we'll call it Y star, is less than potential output. It means we're inside the PPF. So here's the PPF. We're inside it, which means some idle resources or unemployed people. And we've got some level of inflation. We'll call it pi star. So we're in this situation where, let's say, potential is over here. Here is potential output. And we've got this gap here between real GDP and our potential GDP of being on the PPF. And we want to use some fiscal policy. Okay, well, Keynes would advocate increasing government spending or lowering taxes, and that would shift this aggregate demand curve out to the right. So this will be increasing G or lowering taxes or both. And you can see that we'll get a new equilibrium here. And it'll be a higher level of output, and we'll be moving towards potential output. What about the long run? Well, in the long run, we're going to get potential output no matter what we do. In the long run, we're going to be right on the edge of the PPF. And if we want to know what's going to happen in the long run, we use a long run model. So fiscal policy in the long run. In the long run, the aggregate supply curve is vertical at potential output, which means equilibrium is always going to be at potential output right on the edge of the PPF. So we've got inflation over here. So the economy is in a recession, and we increase government spending, and we increase aggregate demand. In the long run, you can see the new equilibrium will still be on the edge of the PPF at full employment. It's that the inflation rate here will be higher. So in this model, in the long run, the only thing that happens is prices change because of the increase or decrease in aggregate demand. So this is just a tool to be used in the short run to move the economy towards potential output. Fiscal policy really doesn't have any effect on the long run, because in the long run, potential output, or the PPF, is determined by the production function. It's determined by how many people we have, the technology, the human capital, the physical capital. It's not determined by our fiscal policy. Let's take another example. Let's say that the economy is at below potential. Below potential. So that means output is less than potential output, or real GDP is less than our potential GDP. And let's say unemployment is 8%. Because if we're inside the PPF, below potential, well, that means there's going to be unemployed people. We're not going to be at full employment. Full employment is right on the edge of the PPF. So being inside the PPF, we need some unemployment rate that's higher than, say, 4 to 6%, maybe 8%. And let's say inflation is 1%. Okay, now we'll draw this situation using the Keynesian macroeconomic model, inflation on the vertical axis, output on the horizontal axis. There is an equilibrium here between the short run aggregate supply curve and the aggregate demand curve. Because in the short run here, remember, the aggregate supply curve is something other than vertical. And so we've got an equilibrium here. And that means that we're at, the equilibrium is 1%. And output, whatever that is something less than potential. Because output is less than potential. So that means potential might be something like here. Here is potential. So we've got this negative output gap. What did Congress and the president do? What did fiscal policy do? Increase government spending or lower taxes. And that will increase aggregate demand and increase output and maybe the inflation rate a little bit too. Now, during the last recession, the pandemic recession, the economy was actually in real good shape before that recession started. The economy really was at full employment. Unemployment before the pandemic, it was 4.1%. So it was either on the PPF or a little bit outside the PPF. The economy was doing very well. Inflation was about 2%, pretty near what federal central banks think is the optimal amount of inflation. Debatable whether it is, but that's what they think. It was exactly what they wanted. So we'll put inflation over here, output over here. The long run supply curve, long run aggregate supply curve is vertical at potential. The short run aggregate supply curve is something other than vertical. And the aggregate demand curve is always downward sloping. So we were right here at just about a perfect economy. Then the coronavirus hits. And suddenly people don't want to fly anymore. Nobody wanted to fly. Nobody wanted to go somewhere and stay in a hotel. Nobody really even wanted to go out to a restaurant, anywhere where they might pick up that coronavirus. Everyone was staying indoors. Big negative shock to the economy. Negative demand shock. So we can look at that as a leftward shift of aggregate demand. Black swan. And the results were big drop in GDP. GDP dropped significantly the first quarter after this happened. Inflation dropped a little bit too. There was actually some deflation going on. Went from 2% to some deflation fairly quickly. Then there was also a shock to aggregate supply because the government in many states shut things down. They intentionally shut things down. And that shifted the supply curve back to the left. Shock to the supply curve. And the results were, it made GDP drop even more because the new equilibrium had GDP falling even further. But kept inflation from dropping too much. So then there was some fiscal policy and stimulus checks. And the point of this fiscal policy was then trying to move this aggregate demand curve to the right. Although it was difficult to do without having a vaccine. Eventually, the GDP recovered. And they've kept up the fiscal policy for some reason. They've kept this expansionary fiscal policy longer than they needed to. And now we're seeing the inflation rate higher than 2%, which makes sense. As this aggregate demand curve would shift to the right, and the aggregate supply curve would start to go back to where it was, then we might end up with higher inflation, partly because of all the government spending going on and lowering of taxes.